The real Doc Holliday was a very, very tough guy. October the 26th, 1881, Tombstone, Arizona, a few minutes before 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Virgil Earp is walking down Fremont Street with his brothers, Wyatt and Morgan, and beside them is a thin, sick-looking man with a long gray coat. That man just swapped his own walking cane for Virgil's shotgun. And he's got it tucked up under his coat so the street don't see it coming. His name's John Henry Holliday. Everybody just calls him Doc. They round the corner towards a vacant lot behind a stable called the OK Corral. That's the vacant lot around the corner from the OK Corral. 5 men are standing there, and at least 2 of them are armed. The Earps call out for them to throw up their hands. Tom McLowry calls back that he's got nothing on him. Then every gun in that lot goes off at once, and Doc Holliday steps out from under his coat with both barrels of a shotgun leveled at Tom McLowry's chest. The whole thing's over in 30 seconds. It's still, all these years later, the most famous 30 seconds in the history of the American West. You've seen that face before, even if you've never read a single word about the real man behind it. Val Kilmer played him in 1993's Tombstone. And it might be the best thing Kilmer ever did on the screen other than Top Gun. He plays Doc as sick and sly. He made like a man a half a second away from either laughing at you or killing you. And you can never quite tell which one's coming. I'm your Huckleberry. You're a daisy if you do. That movie is flat out great filmmaking. And it turned Doc Holliday into the coolest dying man in the history of Westerns. Hollywood gave you the legend. What the actual paper trail says about Doc Holliday is a different story. And it's stranger than the movie had ever had room for. John Henry Holliday was a trained dentist from Georgia with a death sentence sitting in his lungs. And somehow that combination turned him into one of the most feared names on the entire frontier. Here's the paradox sitting right in the middle of the whole legend. The more terrifying his reputation got, the fewer bodies you can actually find underneath it. This is the story of how a Georgia dentist turned into a man that had grown outlaws, scared to look at him cross-eyed. How a body count that barely clears a single digit turned into a legend that put his kill total as high as 16. And how one death, everybody including Doc himself, always figured was coming for him, turned out to be the one death he actually never got. So how does a guy who killed maybe 2 or 3 men his entire life end up the most feared gunfighter in the West ever produced? I'm Mr. V, and welcome back to the Hidden Lens. Doc was born John Henry Holliday on August the 14th, 1851 in Griffin, Georgia. His father, Henry, had been a major in the Confederate Army and worked as a pharmacist before all that. Alice, his mama, raised him on manners in Greek, Latin, and French at a school in Valdosta, Georgia. This was a well-raised Southern boy who was supposed to grow up and be respectable. Then, when John Henry was 15 years old, his mother died of tuberculosis. He had been the one nursing her throughout all of it, sitting with her while her lungs gave out. And doctors now think that's likely where he caught the disease himself. He grew up anyway, trained as a dentist in Philadelphia, graduated in 1872, and opened a practice back home in Georgia. Less than a year later, his cough wouldn't quit. A doctor told him what his mother's disease had already told the rest of the family. Doc Holliday had tuberculosis too. The doctors gave him maybe 6 more months if he stayed in Georgia's wet air, longer if he found someplace dry. So the dentist, he packed up and headed for Texas. Doc opened a new dental office in Dallas, Texas in 1873. It didn't last. Every time he leaned over a patient's mouth, that cough came rattling up out of his chest. And word got around town that the new dentist sounded like a dying man, which he was. Patients stopped showing up, so Doc started dealing cards instead. A gambling game called Pharaoh. And no, not Pharaoh like the Egyptian king, just spelled different. Turned out he was better at that anyway than dentistry. By January 1875, he had already traded gunfire with a Dallas saloon keeper named Charles Austin. Both men emptied their pistols at each other, and both men missed. Some old accounts gave Doc killing an unarmed Dallas businessman a few days after that, just to even the score, I guess. But nobody has ever found a newspaper story or a court paper backing that up. It shows up in legend, and only in legend. Keep that pattern in your back pocket because it's going to repeat itself over and over and over again in this story. By the fall of 1877, Doc had drifted to a rough cattle town called Fort Griffin, Texas, where he met a Hungarian dance hall girl named Mary Catherine Hurry. History mostly remembers her as Big Nose Kate, because with a name like that, I'd rather go with something, 3 short words, Big Nose Kate. The famous version of how the two of them got out of Fort Griffin together goes like this. Doc stealing cards to a local bully named Ed Bailey. Bailey keeps peeking at the discarded cards, which back then was against the rules badly enough to cost a man the whole pot. Well, Doc warns him twice. The third time, Doc just quietly rakes in the pot without a word. Bailey goes for his gun. Doc goes for a knife instead and guts him right there at the table. The town locks Doc up and starts talking about a rope. And Kate supposedly sets a shed on fire to pull the crowd away. Then walks to the jail with a gun in each hand and bursts him loose. They ride out of town on a stolen horse. There's a lot of crime going on, but I don't think the gutting was that bad. It's a hell of a story. It also never once shows up in Fort Griffin newspaper from 1877, which is exactly the kind of the gap that should make you suspicious. Most serious historians today think the whole Ed Bailey killing is made up. Probably something that grew out of Wyatt Earp's own storytelling, told decades later after Doc was already dead and in no position to argue about it, right? So Doc raked in the whole pot without saying a single word, and he still walked away with everything on the table. You don't even need a word to grab that. Just tap that hype button and hit subscribe. Just tap it and keep this rolling, because the story only gets stranger from here. Whatever actually happened in Fort Griffin, Doc and Kate ended up in Dodge City, Kansas, where Doc got to know a young lawman named Wyatt Earp. That friendship would matter for the rest of both of their lives. Underneath all of this sat one fact that never changed. Doc knew he was dying. A doctor had told him already, back in Georgia, and every cough after that was one more reminder the clock was still ticking. A man who had already expected to die young doesn't scare the same way other men do, right? He doesn't have as much left to protect. Here's where the legend really takes off. Over the years, one writer claimed Doc had won more than 30 duels to the death. More than one so-called historian put his kill count at 16 men. By the time the story passed through enough campfires and enough movie screens, Doc Holliday had turned to one of the deadliest killers of the West that the West ever produced. Now, here's what the actual record shows. Gary Roberts wrote the leading biography on Doc's life, and he puts the number of men Doc definitely killed at 2. Tom McLaury in the street fight near the OK Corral, and a drunk troublemaker named Mike Gordon, shot dead in Las Vegas, New Mexico in 1879. Though Doc never once admitted that one, and was never charged for it either. He may have also fired some of the shots that killed a cowboy named Frank Stidwell a few years later in 1882. But so did several other men standing right next to him, so everybody's shooting at the one person. Who's going to take the credit for it? They get the assist, like on basketball, right? So nobody can hand that one to Doc. Everything else in his file is a man who got shot at and missed, or a man Doc wounded but didn't kill. He put a bullet across a gambler's scalp up in New Mexico, and he even shot the wrong 2 people by accident during a drunken argument in Tombstone, putting a bullet through a saloon owner's hand and another through his bartender's toe. In a life built around a 6 gun, the honest count of men Doc Holliday has confirmed to have actually killed can't go past 2. This story has 2 more men worth meeting, though, on the other side of the fight. Ike Clanton ran cattle and ran his mouth even harder. And when the actual bullets started flying at the corral area, He ran then too, leaving his own brother behind to die in that lot. Then there was Johnny Ringo. Some people call him the king of the cowboys. He was cold and well-read, and he was the one man in that whole outfit whose reputation could stand next to Doc's without looking small. In January of 1882, Ringo and Doc actually squared off on a street in Tombstone, both of them reaching for the guns at their same time. This is the one moment in real life that could have made the movie's ending true, except the town's police chief and Wyatt Earp got between the two of them before a single shot went off. And both men got arrested and fined for carrying weapons in town. That's how Doc Holliday's one real face-off with Johnny Ringo actually ended, with a fine. The OK Corral fight, that alley, put Doc and the Earps on top of Tombstone. But it didn't end anything. In December of 1881, gunmen hiding in the dark shot Virgil in the arm and crippled it for good. 3 months later, somebody put a bullet through Morgan Earp's back when he was playing pool, lining up that shot. And he was dead within the hour. No, Virgil never got the use of the arm back for the rest of his life. For Morgan, there was no getting up from the pool table at all. Wyatt Earp decided the courts weren't going to settle this, and Doc rode with him. On the night of March the 20th, 1882, Wyatt, his brother Warren, and Doc, and a few other men that were walking Virgil to the train station at Tucson, Arizona, trying to get him out of the territory alive. Well, in the darkness near the tracks, they spot Frank Stitwell. They're sure he helped kill Morgan. He's lying in wait with a rifle. Stitwell runs. He don't get far. By the time the shooting stops, a witness in town writes that Stitwell is the worst shot-up man he's ever seen in his life. Doc Holliday is one of the men the law later named as having fired those shots. That killing put a murder warrant on Doc's head. And this time, a gun isn't what saved him. Doc ran to Colorado, and Arizona wanted him back to stand trial. His friend, Masterson, was a police chief by then, and he arranged for a fake charge to get filed against Doc in Pueblo, Colorado, just so Colorado would have a reason to hang on to him instead of handing him back over. It worked. The governor of Colorado refused to send Doc back to Arizona. The most feared gunfighter of his age beat a murder charge, not with a fast draw, but with a paperwork trick cooked up by a friend, a famous one at that. The men around this story didn't fare much better than Doc. Ike Clanton was one of those who ran from the corral, during the shootout. He spent the next several years stealing cattle in Arizona hills until a lawman shot him dead on June the 1st, 1881, while he tried to run one more time. Big Nose Kate outlived every one of them. She married and then left that marriage, and she spent decades afterwards working as a housekeeper. Eventually, she talked her way into a retirement home for Arizona pioneers by lying about where she was born, since the home only took American citizens. And she lived there until 1940. Near the end of her life, she gave her own version of the shootout, that famous shootout. She said it wasn't some seasoned gunslingers doing what he always did. It was Doc's first gunfight of his entire life. And afterwards, he came back to the room and cried. Wyatt Earp lived even longer than that, drifting through mining towns before he died in Los Angeles, California in 1929. An old man, mostly forgotten by the country he used to run from. Or, that's it. Doc didn't get that long, though. Through the rest of the 1880s, his lungs kept failing him. And in one Colorado town after another, and by the May of 1887, he had made his way to Glenwood Springs, Colorado, hoping the hot mineral springs there might do something that the doctors couldn't. Well, they didn't. He spent his final weeks bedridden in a room at the Hotel Glenwood. And on the morning of November the 8th, 1887, he asked for a glass of whiskey. And by the counts passed down from that room, he looked towards the foot of the bed and at his own bare feet and said, well, this is funny. And then he died. He was 36 years old. He's buried somewhere in Glenwood Springs, Colorado, though the ground was frozen so hard that winter that nobody today is entirely sure exactly where. A man who spent 14 years expecting a bullet in a saloon or in a street or a train yard went out quietly in a bed instead, and with no boots on at all. So how much of Tombstone actually holds up with Doc? More than you expect. A lot of that clipped 1880s dialogue really was pulled from old newspapers and court records, and Doc's real line before the OK Corral fight was close enough to "you're a daisy if you do" that the movie barely had to touch it. Kilmer plays him like a dying man, treating every conversation as though it might be his last. And that gets us something true about who Doc actually was. But that famous "I'm your Huckleberry" showdown with Johnny Ringo didn't happen the way the movie tells it, and neither did the ending built around it. That whole exchange traces back to a heavily dramatized book written in 1927, 45 years after the fact, not to anything documented at the time. The real Johnny Ringo was found dead in July of 1882 with a bullet in his head, with his own gun in his hand. And the men who found him ruled it a suicide. Doc Holliday was standing in the courtroom in Pueblo, Colorado 2 days before that body turned up. And no train of that era could have made that 1,500-mile round trip between the two places in under 72 hours. The movie's version of Doc Holliday closed out his story by finally getting his name. The real Doc Holliday almost certainly wasn't there at all. Doc Holliday earned almost none of the body count the legend gave him, but the fear was real, always, because the thing that made him dangerous was never really the killing. It was that he had already made peace with dying young, and nobody in the Old West, then or now, has ever quite known what to do with a man like that. If you like this episode, go ahead and give it a like, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next episode of The Hidden Lens. I'm Mr. V, and I'll see you in the next one.